Jewish Federation of Greater Harrisburg. And it is such an honor to be here with these panelists this evening. And I really appreciate all of the attendees taking out your time to learn about this very important and timely topic. Want to thank the hosts, which are Community Responders Network, the Jewish Federation of Greater Harrisburg, the Anti-Defamation League, the Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General, and also the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. We also have numerous co-sponsors who helped get the word out about this program: the Harrisburg chapter of the NAACP, the Muslims of Central Pennsylvania, Moving Circles, Not Our Town Carlisle, MILPA, PA Council of Churches and Interdenominational Ministers Conference, Harrisburg. And there's one thing I just want to start us with, because this is a very challenging and troubling time. And Farzana, who I'll introduce in a moment, always starts us out with a lovely centering moment. And what we'd love to hear as panelists is what is bringing you joy currently. So please feel free to add that to the chat. We'd love to hear that. And in case you didn't hear the initial housekeeping notes, as I mentioned, please keep your video and your sound off. But add questions to the chat. We're going to have our three panelists talk, and then we'll conclude with Q&A. So we will, Farzana and I will be watching all of your questions throughout the program, and we will make sure that we answer as many as possible at the end. And at this point, it is my honor to introduce Farzana Safiola.
Thank you, Jen. And thank you to all the panelists who've taken time from a very busy time to be here this evening. We are multiple things going on at the same time. So I also want to welcome all the CRN members who have taken the time to join the event and guests who are here. The CRN stands for Community Responders Network. It's a grassroots coalition committed to confronting and preventing incidents of bias in Central PA. It's a multi-member coalition with faith groups and social justice groups and some government, local government and state government representatives. So it's a wonderful coalition and gives us a lot of support in this area, especially when incidents that are not so pleasant that occur. With that, I think we'll get started. The format for the evening is we have our speakers. The three speakers will be with us. I'll be introducing them shortly as they start their pieces of the program. They'll have 10 to 15 minutes each. And after all the speakers are done, we will do a Q&A. We ask you to post questions throughout the presentation and we will note them. And you'll have an opportunity to hear responses to your questions. With that, I welcome Robin. Robin is the Senior Associate Regional Director. Robin Burstein joined the ADL in October 2014. She's involved in all aspects of regional operations. She's a trained facilitator in the ADL as a World of Difference Institute. Prior to joining the ADL, Robin was Executive Director of the Greater Harrisburg and North Penn Senior Services. She holds a BA degree in social sciences from Bridgewater State College. And Robin is married to Bob and has 2 married daughters and 4 grandchildren. Robin, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Farzana. Thank you, everybody, for coming. First of all, I am going to share my screen so that you all can see some lovely graphics and get that right to the beginning. And first of all, I want to thank also my colleagues on the panel tonight. ADL has long-standing relationships with the Attorney General's office, as well as the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Thank you, Corbett and Chad, for joining us. And special thanks to Jen and Ann, the Jewish Federation of Greater Harrisburg and the Community Responders Network. ADL, and I think I speak for all of us on this panel and who put this program together when I say this, none of us could do any of our work without each other. We need partners like those that are on this call, and I'm honored to be here. So I want to just talk a minute about ADL and ADL's mission. We were founded in 1913, a time of significant and rising bigotry of all kinds. We were founded with a dual mission: to stop the defamation of the Jewish people, and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. Our mission has not changed over the past 107 years. So I want to lay out some basic understandings. All forms of hate are equally serious and damaging. We at ADL do not believe in comparing suffering. All bigotry is wrong and painful, and it all needs to be addressed seriously and comprehensively by elected officials, law enforcement, community organizations, and individuals like you who have joined us on this call. So let's get into what's actually going on lately. Look at these two images on the bottom left. What you see here are classic anti-Semitic messages that have been repackaged in order to make it relevant for today's age. Just like Jews were blamed for spreading the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages, so too are Jews, Israel being blamed for coronavirus. Conspiracy theories have been part and parcel of the pandemic since early on. There were people who claimed that Israel had a vaccine and that those who spread it are the ones who will provide the cure, thus subliminally claiming that the Jews are behind the new contagion. This type of anti-Semitic slander is little more than a modern version of the blood libel. And speaking of conspiracy theories, while I'm here talking about conspiracy theories, I have to make a little bit of a mention about QAnon and what's going on today. And for those of you who don't know, QAnon is a wide-ranging conspiracy theory that has become popular among a wide range of right-wing extremists. They follow an anonymous personality called Q. Followers of Q believe a pedophiliac global elite, referred to as the deep state or the cabal, control world governments, the banking system, the Catholic Church, agricultural and pharmaceutical industries, the media and entertainment industries, all in order to keep people poor, ignorant, and enslaved. QAnon followers have been linked to multiple incidents of real-world criminality, including murder, vandalism, arson, kidnapping, terrorism, and assault with a dangerous weapon. We have also seen during coronavirus harassment and attacks committed against Asian Americans, from bigoted memes and messages that denigrate Chinese people and blame the Chinese for spreading the disease, to the use of nicknames which link the virus to China and its people in a way that scapegoats and stigmatizes them. Earlier this month, ADL released a new study showing a dramatic spike in anti-Asian sentiment and conspiracy theories and that spread about coronavirus right in the days immediately after the president first got his positive diagnosis on October 2nd. Some are using the coronavirus to argue that the United States should restrict immigration by shutting down its borders, as you see on the sticker on the pole and the images on the far right. Others are attempting to use coronavirus to advance their homophobic agenda by asserting that the virus is a punishment from God for homosexuality, as you can see in the middle top. Here in Pennsylvania, Dr. Hillary Levine, the health secretary for the state, received a variety of disparaging comments on social media, not because of her coronavirus response, but because of who she is and the spotlight that has shined on her during her coronavirus response. Anti-Muslim ideologues are sharing a range of conspiracies aimed at stoking fear. They claim Muslims are defying social distancing rules and are actively trying to spread the virus. A majority of Asian Americans, 58%, and 45% of Black Americans say that it is more common for people to express racist views toward their group since the coronavirus first broke out. We saw white supremacists and other extremist groups use the reopen rallies and their online communities to recruit followers who view government mandated quarantine as overreach, which is an important part of far-right ideology. And we can't not talk about the protests that filled our streets after the killing of George Floyd and what's happening right now in Philadelphia. The protests have placed a spotlight on systemic racism in America. Some of the issues raised include voting rights, education, and the criminal justice system. Voting rights and certain voting measures have been shown to have a discriminatory impact on specific communities. ADL is working to ensure that everyone, regardless of their political preferences, has an equal opportunity to cast their ballot. Data from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights shows that Black students are suspended and expelled at a rate 3 times greater than their white peers, creating what is known as the school to prison pipeline. And ADL has worked with law enforcement for decades. We know that the vast majority of men and women who don a uniform and swear an oath to protect and serve do just that. They are good people who respect the law as well as enforce it. Still, Black people in America represent approximately 20% of the population, but over 60% of the imprisoned population. And action needs to be taken to put an end to police brutality. Research shows more restrictive use of force policies can reduce killings by police and save lives. Black lives matter. And to those who still say all lives matter, of course all lives matter. But the fact is that white lives have always mattered in American society. The same cannot be said for people of color. No one is saying your life doesn't matter. However, until the day comes that Black Americans aren't being killed by members of law enforcement in their homes, in the street, and in their cars, you cannot say that all lives matter. All lives won't matter until Black lives do. As the 2020 election draws closer, we're seeing an alarming uptick in racial and social issues being politicized. Excuse me. We've seen extremists continue to use rhetoric that appears to encourage violence, including commentary specifically related to the election and as a common theme and an upcoming civil war or other conflict. Attempts to spread disinformation about the election and mail-in voting, including widespread social media hoaxes and false claims from pundits or prominent pundits or politicians. Racist and sexist commentary has been put out there about Kamala Harris, and there have been a variety of political commentary and noteworthy statements by extremists, politicians, pundits, and others who really only have a goal to divide and polarize us. And all of this chaos is happening against the backdrop of the largest spike in anti-Semitism that ADL has ever tracked in our over 40 years of tracking anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has been adopted across the ideological spectrum, extremists on the far left and the far right, white supremacists and Black nationalists, Christian fundamentalists and Islamists disagree on literally everything. And yet anti-Semitism is a common thread amongst all of these ideologies. At its core, it boils down to one simple idea: the Jews are to blame. As you see on the slide, across the country, there was a 12% increase in anti-Semitic incidents reported in our audit. Pennsylvania had 109 incidents, the second highest, largest ever in Pennsylvania since we began recording in 1979. That is the 5th highest number of incidents in the country. And in Pennsylvania, it was an increase of 22%. 10% above the national average. The challenges are great. We are called again to fulfill ADL's mission, to fight the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. These goals are complementary. If you want Jews to live without fear in the United States, You should march for equality and justice for Black people, Latinos, and all Americans. And if you believe that America needs to work harder to deliver equality and justice to all its people, then you should stand with us against anti-Semitism, regardless of where it originates. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop my share screen. I know you're going to hear from my friends, and we're all going to stick around and answer questions later.
Thank you, Robin. Really appreciate that presentation. And I'll ask folks to post their questions in the chat so we can, Robin can respond to them later. We'll now move on to Mr. Corbett Anderson. He's the chief of the Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General's Civil Rights Enforcement Section. The section seeks to protect and advance the civil rights of Pennsylvanians. Before joining the Attorney General's office in 2018, Corbett worked 19 years at the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in various supervisory, policy, and litigation positions. His career began in private practice with the law firm Buchanan Ingersoll, headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Corbett is a graduation of Indiana University of Pennsylvania, Howard University School of Law, and Georgetown University of Law Center. He was born in Philadelphia and grew up in Westchester, Pennsylvania. Corbett? You're in mute. I think you're in mute.
Sorry about that. I appreciate being here. Thank you for the invitation. Let me try to share my screen here and then we can get started. Okay, so again, I'm Corbett Anderson. I'm the chief of the Civil Rights Enforcement Section in the Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General. I wanted to first just orient you to the Office of Attorney General and where our Civil Rights Enforcement Section actually sits within it. So the section has a number of different functions and roles. We can, independently of any complainant, file complaints with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. We can pursue civil rights actions in state and federal court as the sort of parent or guardian of the people's welfare. We can pursue civil injunctions and other equitable relief in consultation with district attorneys for ethnic intimidation, which in Pennsylvania is what hate crimes are considered, as well as institutional vandalism, which is not a hate crime per se, but very much similar to a hate crime in that it's a criminal act against a school or a community center or a church or synagogue. And we also pursue, we conduct outreach and work with our partners to do outreach and to engage the community. I'm having trouble advancing my slides here. Please bear with me for a second. Okay, so there we go. So at the Attorney General's office, there are three major divisions: the Criminal Law Division, which does what you would expect; the Civil Law Division, which is a part of the agency that defends all of the state agencies whenever they get sued; and then there's the Public Protection Division, which is the division that the Civil Rights Enforcement Section is in. And the Public Protection Division sort of helps to advance the rights of people and protect their rights in a number of areas, civil rights being one of them. The Civil Rights Section has ebbed and flowed in terms of its staffing and the resources that have been available to it. I joined the agency 2 years ago, and one of my tasks was to help to rebuild the Civil Rights Enforcement Section to some of its prior glory, say in the 80s and the 90s when it began. We've identified a number of areas that we think are important for civil rights here in the Commonwealth: hate crime, fair housing, criminal history record information, police community relations, access and accommodations for people with disabilities, equity in our schools, immigrants' rights, and LGBTQ equality. With respect to hate crime, my section, the AG's office in general, has a certain role and somewhat limited authority. There are two primary statutes in the Commonwealth that cover hate crime or hate crime related incidents. And I mentioned them earlier. There's the ethnic intimidation statute and the institutional vandalism statute. Ethnic intimidation occurs when someone commits a crime under Pennsylvania's Crimes Code, and there are a number of listed crimes that applies to, and does so with a biased motivation towards a person's race or color or religion or their national origin. If someone commits the underlying crime and has that biased motivation, then the crime is enhanced, and there are enhanced penalties for committing that crime. Institutional vandalism does not require a biased motivation. It requires someone to knowingly deface or damage, again, a number of institutional, buildings or pieces or properties, schools, synagogues, churches, community centers, things of that nature. And again, institutional vandalism does not require a biased motivation. The AG's office does not have primary criminal jurisdiction generally for most matters here in the Commonwealth. That obligation, that duty, that jurisdiction lies primarily with our county district attorneys. We do have some criminal jurisdiction in some unique areas, and we can assume jurisdiction if there's some sort of conflict of interest that a county district attorney has. In the area of ethnic intimidation and institutional vandalism, our primary role and our primary authority is to engage in civil enforcement on the civil side. What that generally means is, as I mentioned earlier, we have the authority to pursue a civil injunction if there's been ethnic intimidation and it's recurring in such a way that a court order is required in order to stop it. If that occurs, then we would have the ability to go in and get a civil injunction. One thing about that is that the ethnic intimidation or the civil rights statute that allows for a suit for ethnic intimidation also gives the individual who's been victimized the right to go to court on their own behalf. That's really important because while my section, the AG's office, can get an injunction, the individual who's been harmed can get not just an injunction, but also punitive damages. And that can be an important deterrent against hate crimes and ethnic intimidation. Even though we don't have criminal jurisdiction, it's important to point out that we have a philosophy here in the AG's office that there are no closed doors. So if something comes to us and we think it's something that should be addressed by the police or a district attorney, then we can and we will refer that matter out and make sure that it gets the attention that it deserves. In addition, even though we don't have, again, criminal jurisdiction, we do try to play an important role as a partner to not just law enforcement, but to ADL, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, the city commissions around the state, and even at the federal level, we have partnerships there as well. We've put together on our website a combating hate crimes resource guide that I would urge you to take a look at. And we've also put together sort of a diagram that takes you through the steps that are important for you to take if you feel that you're the victim of a hate crime, and then giving you a sense of what happens when not just the AG's office, but any law enforcement or civil rights agency gets a report of a hate crime or something that could be a hate crime. And I just want to walk you through this in a way that's less intimidating here. So the first thing to keep in mind is that a lot of hate crimes, a lot of discrimination in general, a lot of bias occurs through speech. And In America, we have freedom of speech that's guaranteed by our First Amendment. It's an important right to speak freely. It's really vital to our democracy to disagree and to work out our disagreements through talking to each other, even if that conversation is uncomfortable sometimes. But it's also important to realize that sometimes speech can violate the law. You know, your money or your life, that's speech, but it violates the law. That's a crime. Sleep with me or you're fired. That's speech, but it violates the law. What we want to make sure that everyone keeps in mind is that there's a vast array of things that can happen to a person that are hurtful and potentially biased. And when you are the victim of a hurtful or a biased incident, and you feel that it could be a crime or a hate crime, it's important to complain about that to law enforcement. Make a complaint. It's not really your job to determine if the law has or hasn't been violated. That's really our job here in the AG's office or the police department or the district attorney or the Pennsylvania State Police or the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. And so what we urge is for you to report incidents that occur so that we can do our jobs and help you and help the broader community to stamp out hate and bias incidents. If it's an emergency, contact 911, obviously. That's really important. If it's a non-emergency, there are a number of agencies that you can and should report to. First of all, you contact the police, contact the state police or the FBI at the federal level. These are the, you remember the line from Law and Order, these are the entities that investigate the crimes, and the prosecutors prosecute the crimes after the investigation has occurred, typically. So go to the police if there's an incident that you think could be a crime and could be a bias-motivated crime. You can also go to the district attorney. Again, there are no closed doors. So go to the district attorney, go to the US attorney at the federal level, come to the Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General. There are a number of state and local commissions on human relations. The PHRC, who you'll hear from in a minute, they're the primary state agency that is set up to protect and investigate and adjudicate claims of discrimination, not criminal, but civil rights violations. At the federal level, there's the EEOC, there's the Department of Housing and Urban Development, there's the Department of Education if something happens in the education context. In addition, there are non-governmental entities who are important partners to government. ADL is one of them, the NAACP, APABA, the Association for Asian Pacific American Bar Association, I'm sorry. So any of these entities are portals for a complaint about discrimination or bias or a potential hate crime. On the left of your screen, those are basic definitions of what we're talking about. The first definition is the broadest. This is a bias incident. That's some offensive or hurtful act that may not be a crime, but it's motivated by bias or prejudice. It may not be a crime, it may not be illegal, but these are incidents that could amount to that with further investigation. Hate crimes and ethnic intimidation, those are what I mentioned earlier, underlying crimes that are enhanced because of the bias motivation. That bias motivation, that discrimination, that hate hurts not just the person who's targeted, but the entire community. And so the penalty for engaging in hate crimes or ethnic intimidation is enhanced for that reason. And then again, there's unlawful discriminatory practices, things that occur in the context of the workplace, in the context of a school day, in the context of a number of situations that are covered by our civil rights laws. Once you report an incident that's hurtful or offensive and biased, it's law, as I mentioned, it's law enforcement's obligation to figure out, is it covered by the law? And if so, who is responsible for investigating it and potentially seeking some sort of remedy, whether it's civil or criminal. And so that's what we'll do. If we get the complaint, we'll triage it, and we will confer with our partners at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, if necessary, to determine which agency is best able to handle this type of incident. And we'll make that referral, or we'll handle ourselves if it's something that we have jurisdiction over. Next step, there may be an investigation. We may investigate, the police will investigate, U.S. Attorney, any entity can do some sort of rudimentary investigation. Even if they don't have quote unquote jurisdiction, they may look, there has to be some minimal investigation, at least to know that for a fact. And then if they do have jurisdiction, there will be a more robust seeking out and ferreting out of the evidence, whether it be witness testimony or documentary evidence, preservation letter to Facebook or what have you. Those are the steps that any investigative agency would take. Then there could be, in some smaller minority of those cases, some sort of legal action taken. In the context of, in a criminal context, there may be a prosecution by the district attorney, or at the federal level, there could be a prosecution by U.S. Attorney, the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. If there's a conflict on the criminal side and the district attorney can't prosecute, then our office may do so. There are also, again, civil rights agencies at the state, local, and federal level that can seek relief as well. The Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations, the Philadelphia Commission on Human Relations, EEOC, HUD, et cetera. And lastly, I mentioned the victim themselves can pursue these types of relief. So, the victim can't prosecute a case in the criminal sense, but if something happens, bias incident happens at work, it may be covered by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The person can pursue that on their own behalf. Or if it's a hate crime, again, a person can pursue that hate crime under state law and get punitive damages. And the last reason that it's important to complain about discrimination, about hate crimes, potential bias incidents in general, and give that report to, send that report to one of the agencies that I mentioned earlier, is that we do try to monitor trends. We try to know where there are hot spots, where there may need to be outreach. We compile reports and send them to each other. One of the primary agencies that does that is the Philadelphia Commission on Human Relations. We just got a report within the last day or so from the person who compiles that report, and it's helpful to know what's going on in the Commonwealth. And so with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Chad.
Thank you so much, Corbett. Really appreciate the role of your office and the areas of authority. I think that was really valuable to share with those attending this evening. Chad, I know he might have been interrupted. I know he's expecting a press at his door. So I think we'll take any questions if there are any at this time. Jen, is that right? We should just do the questions, right? Since Chad's not here yet. Jen,
There is one question, which is if both of you could speak to what we should be expecting next week as the votes are being tallied, and what people and institutions can do to stay safe.
Well, I guess I'll start. There's a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety around the election. And for I think good reason, because we're in a time where we're polarized. Number one, hate incidents, hate crimes have increased in the last years. We have, or last several years. As Robin mentioned earlier, we do have, we're in a situation now where there's, unrest because of police brutality or perceived police brutality. And all of this is sort of attacking the seams of our union. And so it's right to, I think it's legitimate to be fearful. My recommendation for people is to go about your business and report things that you think are hateful or biased, as I mentioned earlier. One thing you should know is that in terms of voter intimidation, voter interference, those things are illegal under Pennsylvania law. People cannot stop you from voting. If that's occurring, report that. Report it to the local police, report it to the election officials first, but report it to the police, report it to the district attorney, report it to us. And again, we'll try to figure out whose jurisdiction it is and who should address it. But I would be lying to you to say that you should not be fearful.
Robin, do you want to add something? Oh, you're muted, Robin.
Okay, I unmuted myself and you muted me at the same time, but that's okay. So I was reading something in the chat, and so I think the question was about the upcoming election. Can you just rephrase it for me again real quick, Jen?
Certainly. What should we anticipate, and how do you protect individuals and institutions with the potential unrest that even Corbett said we should be fearful about?
Yes, okay. So first of all, ADL wants everybody to just be patient. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. It's going to be different. And, just let the counters do their jobs and be patient, number one. Number two, there is some extremist chatter. There are people who are saying, on both sides, no matter what the outcome of this election is, there may be some activity by extremists. That is very concerning. And ADL, along with all of our partners, I'm sure Corbett's office, et cetera, we are all watching it. We are all monitoring it, and we are all communicating with each other so that there should be no issues. In addition to that, ADL has created a system where if you are at the polls or you see something inappropriate happening, election related, Andrea, I'm going to ask you to post it in the chat. There is a text that you can text to ADL, and we will immediately send it to the group of people that we have watching election-related extremism, and it will be responded to fairly immediately. We have added people to our Center on Extremism to specifically watch what's going to be happening on the election and to be able to respond to it as soon as possible. So we're going to post that in the chat and take that down. And if you are a witness of anything, please let us know. But I think the biggest thing is to not panic, not get ahead of ourselves. Let's see what happens as it plays out, as things happen. Report it. Folks like Corbett, folks like Chad, folks at the ADL, we will all respond and the community will take care of it.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you very much. And Chad, we just took a few questions, and now I think we're ready for you. If you are, I'll just do a brief introduction. Chad Dion Lassiter is a nationally recognized in the fields of American race relations and violence prevention among African-American males. Mr. Lassiter has worked on race, peace, and poverty-related issues in Africa, Canada, Haiti, Israel, and Norway, and is called upon frequently by media outlets to comment on race relations and violence prevention. He's a co-founder and current president of the Black Men at Penn School of Social Work. The group seeks to recruit Black males into the profession of social work as well as providing anti-racism and violence prevention trainings to urban and suburban schools around the country. He has been recognized as one of the young leaders of the future under 30 by Ebony Magazine and Who's Who among African Americans, with such notables as Colin Powell and Michael Jordan. On November 18, 2019, Mr. Lassiter was inducted into the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Work Alumni Hall of Fame. Prior to accepting his post at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, Mr. Lassiter was executive director of the Red Cross House with the American Red Cross of Eastern Pennsylvania, a visiting scholar at Westchester University in the Undergraduate School of Social Work. He was also a former adjunct professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice, where he was the 2008 recipient of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Involvement Award. He's a former research fellow at the Research Institute at the University of Pennsylvania Grad School of Education, where he worked on 2 national research projects. Welcome, Chad.
Thank you. I hope that we don't underscore the first presentation by Robin, and in particular, the graphic images that we saw. One of those images were one of the images that the former president of the NAACP, Rodney Muhammad, actually used and stated that he did not know that it was anti-Semitic. I think in context here in the 21st century, anyone who does not know that that image and that trope is not anti-Semitic, something that's problematic. That's almost like some of our colleagues who say, I didn't think blackface was offensive. You know, in the 21st century, the moment we find ourselves in, you have to know that. And then building upon all that she stated, we go to Corbett Anderson. And I think when we look at that graphic, I'm a visual person. I think that graphic was really great, and all of the material. And what you'll see is there's a lot of synergy between the ADL, the AG's office and the division that Corbett is in, and certainly the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. So in the brief time that I have, I use some visuals as well. And I want to just expand, not just the work of the PHRC, but I wanted to look at where we are in our democracy, as we're not certain who's going to be the president of the United States, if there's going to be a re-election. I'm also here to say I kind of disagree with President Obama when he said we're not red states, we're not blue states, we're the United States. We can be red states and we can be blue states. We just don't need to have the vitriol and the venom that we have in our democracy. So I titled this, For the Moments That I Have, Towards a Pedagogy of Justice, because I really fundamentally believe that's what we're trying to get to. Can we advance to the next slide? Thank you. So I thought it was important to really look at, we have a lot of definitions about racism. And Dr. King said that racism is a philosophy based on a contempt for life. It is the arrogant assertion that one race is the center of value and object of devotion, before which other races must kneel in submission. It is the absurd dogma that one race is responsible for all of the progress of history and alone can assure the progress of the future. Racism is a total estrangement. It separates not only bodies, but minds and ultimately spirits. Inevitably, it descends to inflicting spiritual and physical homicide upon the outgroup. Most of us don't know that King mentioned this. This came out of King's, one of his seminal work, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? Advance, please. Robin is absolutely right when she talked about anti-Semitism. And so the great W.E.B. Du Bois, who worked with his contemporary Jane Covington with the Niagara movement, were instrumental in establishing the NAACP. For all of us viewing this, we need to make sure that we never get seduced by this concept of black-white binary or race, right? Because there have been an equal amount of our white and our Jewish colleagues who have worked on behalf of the humanity of all. But when Du Bois talked about the problem of the 20th century as the problem of the color line, Du Bois was talking about white supremacy. White supremacy is a tree. There are branches of xenophobia, branches of homophobia, branches of transphobia, branches of prejudice, branches of anti-Semitism, so forth and so on. Advance. We come back to King, and we're talking about violence in this moment. We know that Pennsylvania ranks number 8 in the state based on the data from the ADL and the Southern Poverty Law Center, with hate groups assembling. And we look at the violence in the context of the moment we see ourselves in, whether that's Walter Wallace or whether that's George Floyd. and the number of these. And we always talk about, well, Black lives matter, then why don't they matter to Black people? Why are Black people killing Black people? That's a myth. That is what we call intra-violence. Black people kill Black people, white people kill white people, Asian American Pacific Islanders kill Asian American Pacific Islanders, Native Indigenous kill Native Indigenous, and finally Latinx kill Latinx. People kill people that they're in close proximity to. So King starts with the concept of the greatest purveyor of violence in the world is my own government. He talked about the triple evils of being poverty, militarism, and racism. And it's important for me to unpackage this for you all because I come out of that tradition. The work that I do at the PHRC is not a job, it's an assignment. I come from Philadelphia. I never wanted to go to Harrisburg. I go to bed every night at 10 o'clock. I get up at 4 o'clock and I head to Harrisburg Monday through Thursday, as I'm also taking care of a 79-year-old mother who has early onset of Parkinson's, and I'm newly engaged, and I also have a puppy. But when we phrase this as a diseased democracy, it's not something that we're just trying to defame our beautiful country, but that comes out of Ben Franklin saying that a diseased democracy, you know that is diseased by what? Voter apathy. Next slide. And certainly as an African-American and just as a human being, I can't make sense of some of the looting where I see young males, taking televisions and things of that nature. But the great Jimmy Baldwin talked about Black rage in context. And certainly when we heard Dr. Martin Luther King verbalize that riots are the language of the unheard, I'm almost certain as a student of King and coming out of that tradition that he wasn't talking about the phenomenon that we see now. And I'm not here to defame young activists and individuals who have anger. I just think that is a more therapeutic and spiritual way to deal with the moment we find ourselves in. But Jimmy Baldwin said to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. Not speaking for him, but a person like Corbett and myself, we live in the Black body. We have to compartmentalize the Black fatigue that oftentimes erodes our mind, bodies, and spirits. And then we have to be socially justice neutral because at PHRC, though I'm African-American, I don't buy into a form of ethnocentrism. We just had an event, the significant relationship between Blacks and Jews. The next week, I'm going to have to do something as it relates to some other form of unlawful discrimination. Advance, please. Prior to that one. So Jimmy also said, love for America. He said, I love America more than any other country in the world. And, exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. I just believe that any criticism has to be out of that beloved community that Martin Luther King and Rabbi Abraham Yahshua Heschel mentioned. Advance, and we'll get to what PHRC is. The myth of American exceptionalism. We live in a world where we're talking about acculturation, angle of conformity, American exceptionalism. And at this pivotal moment, I wanted to bring W.E.B. Du Bois into this discussion where he says either America will destroy ignorance or ignorance will destroy the United States. We're living in a democracy where individuals are saying, we're going to kidnap the governor of Michigan. We have swastikas that are being placed in various places, nooses and things of that nature. And if you don't like Jewish people, and if you don't like African Americans, and if you don't like LGBT, and if you don't like disabled people, don't harm us. Don't engage in a form of vitriol and violence and take our lives. So we'll go into PHRC, advance. So we asked the question, and a lot of you know who PHRC is, and this is a refresher for some, but I start from the standpoint of we are the top civil rights enforcement agency in Pennsylvania, and that's theoretical. Like Corbett, I've been in this position for 29 months. I want to get it back to being the top civil rights enforcement agency in practice from the days of our dear colleague, Ann Van Dyke and multiple others. And we're working there. We're on our way to changing the ethos to get us to a level where we're there for individuals in the Commonwealth. So advance. So briefly, we were started in 1945. There was a bill introduced, 1952. You see the data here. But in context, the PHRC came about because the governor at that time asked the question, how many of you have people of color working in your offices? And very few hands went up. How many of you would actually hire a person of color in your respective offices? And very few hands went up. And so they decided to create the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, not just from that standpoint, but also we know that racism during that time was going unacknowledged and unchecked. And so there needed to be a curator, a convener to look at this. And this is some of the history, as you can see, advance. It's important that we recognize that it's not a either or, it's a both and. It's a two-part mission. And that one mission is to enforce PA non-discrimination laws. That's the PHRA, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. There's a part in our act that talks about civil unrest. And so when the protests actually started because of the killing of George Floyd in Philadelphia and throughout Pennsylvania, and they were engulfed and taken over by aspects of dissenters, whether they were white interlopers or Asian provocateurs on every side of the color line and gender line, I and a few members of our team, we were out monitoring these unrests, similar to what the Anti-Defamation League does. Our colleague Rue Landau in Philadelphia and Randy Duque. I mean, to me, both of those organizations have the best on the ground. Let's observe, let's conciliate, let's mediate some of the conflict. And then the PA Fair Educational Act. And then the second part is to promote equal opportunity for all in PA, not African Americans, not just, one side of the color line, but for all people in PA. Advance. And so when we're talking about promoting equal opportunity, key partnerships, community relations and activities and task force. We have the PA Attorney General, PA State Police, other local, state, and federal partners, certainly the Anti-Defamation League, certainly the Community Response Network. There's not been a month that has gone by in the 29 and a half months I've been at PHRC that I don't get something from Ann and her colleagues, CRN, that's letting us know in various catchment areas what's happening in Carlisle as it relates to a form of unlawful discrimination, what's happening in Hazleton, what's happening in Berks, what's happening around the state. And that's very important. And that leads me to the next bullet, which is we have advisory councils. We oftentimes verbalize they are our eyes and ears, and they let us know what's happening. There's a new phraseology that I've been introducing to our staff. They're not our eyes and ears. They are our social justice vanguard with a reservoir of passion and knowledge and skill set. In Carlisle, there's Marcia and her beautiful husband. In Hazleton, it's Elaine Curry and Bob Curry. And my grandmother would say, don't get into calling names because you're going to forget someone. But they're very important individuals. And then we have our local commissions. We have our advocacy organizations like the Urban League, the NAACP, our colleague Hank Butler with the Jewish Coalition and multiple others. Next, advance, please. So when we're talking about promoting equal opportunity, training and outreach, the PHRC, when I first got there, I reached out to the Anti-Defamation League so that we can be trained on unconscious bias. Wait a minute, E.D. Lassiter, we're a civil rights enforcement agency. Why are you bringing in the Anti-Defamation League to train us on implicit, explicit bias? It wasn't a Socratic question. It was merely because we come to a context with biases. We come to a context with forms of prejudice. We come to a context with a form of toxic masculinity. We come to a context with a form of male privilege, class privilege, ideological frameworks. And so it was very important, and it proved by the metrics, i.e. the survey from the staff, that it was one of the best trainings we've had. And we're going to be partnering with the Anti-Defamation League because in this moment that we're in, there's a lot of silence in our organization. There are some white staff that want to say, hey, why are they looting, or why are they running from the police? Or they might want to say, hey, listen, I don't understand all this, or I'm sorry that happened. And so I want to work on making sure that our white staff are not feeling forms of ambivalence or white guilt. I want to make sure our African-American staff and others recognize factors of redemption, restorative justice, and not retribution in our thoughts and our actions. Also, we have a social justice lecture series, and the social justice lecture series has brought in Jane Elliott, Tim Wise, multiple others. It's very important that we hear from intersectionality, that we look at LGBT, that we bring in activists who are speaking to multiple audiences about the moment we find ourselves in. And then our No Hate in Our State town halls, which actually is that reimagining the beloved community. And then we do commentary through various social media and various other things. Next slide. we're made up of 67 counties. It's important to know that we're all over PA. We have a very small complement. I really believe that we're going to build it and get it to a point where we can really be there for multiple counties. We have 3 regional offices, one in Pittsburgh, one in Harrisburg, one in Philadelphia. Our infrastructure is, we're not a nonpartisan organization. It's the governor's office. It's our 11 commissioners who some are 6 are Republican, 5 are Democrat. And then we have me as the executive director, 3 regional directors, and just a robust staff. 2 federal contracts, a HUD contract, an EEOC contract, where we investigate the claims of unlawful discrimination. But beyond processing contract, we're making a paradigm shift where we're looking for justice, and we look for justice wherever it is, in public accommodation and commercial property. We look for justice in the lack of educational equity in education, English as a second language, and et cetera. Advance. So what and who does the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act cover? Advance. Very briefly, you see that we cover employment, housing, commercial property, public accommodations, education. I want to go back just really briefly when we look at housing. It was a tutorial and educational moment for me to learn about assistant animals, that you can have an animal that's trained to alert you when to take your diabetes medication, and there may be a landlord that will discriminate against you and not let you into that apartment, and you have the right to have that assistant animal with you. And so I don't come to the context knowing everything. And so I'm a student of history, a student of human rights, a student of civil rights, and that was an eye-opener for me. Next slide. We talk about what classes are protected. I really admired the work of my contemporary Rue Landau, because the Philadelphia Human Relations Commission, which is the city human relations, they cover more protected classes than we do. We have jurisdiction, and you heard Corbett so eloquently verbalized earlier that we don't have criminal, but definitely civil. And so words have meaning. So when someone says something anti-Semitic, or when someone, graffitis or defaces property, people say, oh, well, that person hurled the N-word, and that's a form of freedom, freedom of speech and things of that nature. No, we have ethnic and racial intimidation laws that are on the book. And one of our experts in that area is Carl Summerson, who is our hearing examiner. And so we need to be very careful of words. Words have meaning, words matter, and there are civil remedies around that as well. So these are our protected classes. Next slide. Certainly to the images that Robin showed, I want to be very intentional when I say to you, and I have 2 minutes, so I'm going to wrap up, and my slides are coming to an end. Thank you. I want to be very intentional in showing this, that certainly PHRC, we are on every side of the color line, every side of the gender line, but I did want to just leave us with the impression of the moment, because I figured that Robin was going to say Black Lives Matter. I just, and knowing her, and I wanted to just show acts of harm to Black humanity. Certainly at PHRC, there's acts of harm to everyone. Next slide. I'll meet the 2-minute limit. Another act of harm, that's Breonna Taylor on the left, that's Sandra Bland on the right. Next slide. And then acts of harm to Black humanity, Michael Brown on the left and Trayvon Martin on the right. Next slide. As we come to an end, I just want to simply say that I really believe that no matter the outcome of the election, that these organizations that's on this panel, those of you who are in the audience, that we have a long road ahead of us, and it's not going to be 2021. I want to see what we look like for the entire decade, dedicating ourselves to this decade, and coming out of this decade, hopefully recognizing the humanity of all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chad. And wrapping up all that in a few minutes that we gave you, and really appreciate your wisdom that you shared with us this evening. I think there was a question, Jennifer?
Yes, we actually have several great questions, so I'll start asking them, and any of the panelists can feel free to respond. The first one is, aside from prosecuting, are there restorative justice measures agencies pursue to try to have meaningful interventions that may result in a real transformation?
Just really briefly, from the PHRC perspective, we do have ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution Programs. We have a very robust mediation program that at the moment has really settled about $625,000 in such a short period of time. And then I really believe that some of the things that we're doing with our no hate in the state town halls are forms of restorative justice. But certainly those are just things that I wanted to contribute.
So ADL does not get involved. We leave the criminal justice issues to law enforcement, and all of our work is actually focused on making whatever the incident is into a teachable moment. You know, a lot of our work, as Chad mentioned, is about helping people understand their own biases and how they play into what they're doing. So most of ADL's work is focused in that direction, as far as what is there to learn. If there's an incident that happens in a school, let's say, where a kid writes the N-word and scratches it into a desk, you know, we take that moment and we provide resources to that school for those teachers to be able to discuss slurs and inappropriate words, right? To be able to discuss race and racism, to be able to discuss those things in the classroom and not necessarily even call out the perpetrator or highlight, you know, focus in on what happened or highlight the target, but to make it into a general conversation in the classroom where kids learn from it, about it. And so that's where ADL stands on that.
I'll just say, I can't speak for the criminal side of our office, but here in the civil rights enforcement section, you know, sometimes we get complaints of discrimination or mistreatment that aren't really illegal per se, or aren't incidents that would require or should require a lawsuit per se. But we will, as Robin mentioned, we'll reach out and we will offer education, we'll offer some sort of training, we'll explain what kind of policies would best prevent this type of situation from coming up in the future. And to that extent, yeah, we do engage in a way that's not just filing lawsuits.
So the next question is if Pennsylvania citizens are allowed to carry arms in and or around polling places.
A number of polling places are schools and other protected buildings in which firearms are not permitted. But as a general matter, firearms are allowed to be carried here in the state of Pennsylvania, but you have to be careful not to take it into a polling place that is a school or some other building that does not allow firearms.
And the person didn't ask this specifically, but I heard that it can even be an open carry. That was a bit surprising to me. Can you speak to that a little bit? Outside the polling places?
Under the elections code, ostentatiously brandishing firearms around a polling place could be considered voter intimidation. So I would encourage anyone who's thinking of openly carrying a firearm around a polling place to rethink that and to refrain from doing that, lest you be charged, convicted of voter intimidation.
That's a relief. Thank you for clarifying that. One of the next questions is what your thoughts are on the term defunding the police.
Yeah, I think words certainly matter, and linguistically, my understanding is that people are not talking about defunding the police. They're talking about equitable redistribution, where our police departments are not funded to the level where they are almost like a paramilitary force with high-tech weapons. And one of the things that we do know, and the data is very replete, that when some of our armed services and the wars that we had, those materials, that equipment ended up coming back. And so if you look at, I was in Ferguson with one of my mentors, Cornell West, and we were on the ground, and it looked like, the movie that I saw visually called Black Hawk Down. It was like, are you serious? Like some of the weapons, some of the armory, things of that nature. I think what most activists that I know and that I actually interact with and learn from are saying that a redistribution of funds that can go into Head Start programs, after school programs, mentoring programs, think about the Walter Wallace situation most recently. Very tragic. There were 3 calls to the house on that particular day. Why not dispatch community interventionists, trauma nurses? When you look at the Hospital University of Penn, when you look at Temple University, we have some of the top trauma centers in Philadelphia, but also just for equity purposes throughout Pennsylvania. But looking at that incident, maybe sending a social worker, maybe training our police officers on mental health first aid. We're asking our police officers to do too much. They have to be able to be in the moment, perform a biopsychosocial assessment, understand bipolar, understand the DSM-4 axis 2, that the person has all this. That's just too much. And so I see it as a redistribution of funds where we can put social workers in schools and not resource officers. But I think we have to be very, very careful. I don't want to live in a world where we're pointing fingers and saying it's all police. But I do want to live in a world where we can be free and we can move about without suspicion and surveillance.
And I would agree 100% with what Chad just said. And some of the reallocation, hopefully, potentially would be on retraining the police on how to respond to other situations, right? So it's not even taking away the funding from the police to other agencies and organizations, but working with the police to use other methods, not deadly force, and to do some anti-bias training or any of those kinds of things that would really be helpful and to improve police relations in the communities.
Thank you. So here's another excellent question. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat and I will field them. How does the president's ban on diversity training impact your work? I'd love to hear from all of you on that question.
So it impacts our work tremendously at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. The executive order does not go into effect until November 27th, but it's an actual living, breathing document. We did a 3-part unconscious bias training at Bloomsburg University. And Bloomsburg University asked us to take some of the language out of our presentation. And as executive director, there were some ideological differences where some commissioners were like, we need to dig our heels in and we shouldn't do it. And I said, this is what the university is asking us to do. And we did that. We also have federal contracts. That executive order was very clear, ceasing to test from using words like white privilege, whiteness, critical race theories, and that nature. On our legal side, I learned that one of the things that we were doing was discussing working with Corbett Anderson. And I know that my interim chief counsel met with Corbett to discuss the possibility of a partnership and maybe suing the Trump administration. But it has impacted our work tremendously. But also outside of my role at PHRC, I also looked at it from a humanistic standpoint. And I'm not siding with the president, but I've sat in on these trainings, and there have been times, not with the Anti-Defamation League, Robin, certainly not with you, but some of these federal trainings I've sat in, and for 10 years I've done some of them. And if I'm a white person, I'm walking away like, damn, like white privilege, like, this is like really, it beats me up. So it's that white guilt. A lot of my colleagues are just like, well, Chad, they never talk about this. And, I didn't create those structures. And so for me, when I saw that executive order, I said, hey, listen, how can we still engage in a way, albeit the executive order, and we know that executive orders don't go away like, that quick. And so just really great question, whoever put that out there, Jennifer. But for me, I just wanted to share how it has impacted our work, but I'm okay with going from white supremacy to microaggressions at this moment. I don't want to put my agency in a blind spot where we say something, all of a sudden, our HUD contract funding and our EOC contract funding is away while we're metaphorically and really literally digging our heels in. I think this moment that we're in at some point is going to be over. And I'm not talking about the election as it relates to all of the hatred, but we have a lot of work to do. But it's impacted our work. It has impacted our work. But there are ways that you can kind of like, implement, the same thing, but just, kind of soften the language. And it's not like you're compromising your morals, your principles, your moral compass, your moral imperative. It's just the moment that we find ourselves in.
From my view, where I sit at ADL, I have not seen it impact our work at all. As a nonprofit organization that receives no government funding, So it doesn't directly impact us. What it impacts is the community's perception of whether or not bias training is appropriate and a good thing or not, which, ADL obviously believes it is. And so we have been busier than ever working with all types of organizations, schools, et cetera, on our anti-bias work. We are now partnering with a private company to provide anti-bias work to law enforcement. So the executive order doesn't even really impact us that much there. So we haven't seen, because of the kind of work that ADL does and who we do it for, more community organizations, not necessarily government organizations, it hasn't really affected us.
And here in the Civil Rights Enforcement section, in terms of the outreach that I do, the executive order hasn't really touched my outreach, in the sense that I tend to focus on what the law is, what the law says, what the case law says, and interpreting that law. I do talk about implicit bias and unconscious bias. My interpretation of the executive order is that it's not quite a straw man. There is, and Chad mentioned this to some degree, there is, I think, sometimes overzealous, poorly executed trainings that could be better advised to shy away from certain concepts and teachings in a way that could be misinterpreted. What the executive order does is it says any training that says or implies that someone is biased based on race or sex because of their race or sex, that's really what the heart of what it's trying to get at. There's a kernel of truth to that. I would advise any person conducting training not to include that sort of concept. We all have biases. Chad mentioned that earlier. We all have unconscious biases in various spheres of our lives that we bring to the table. We should all make sure that we combat and root out those biases so that they don't affect our behavior, and so that we can create that beloved community that Chad mentioned. But our biases are not because of our race or our sex. So that's something that I would not say, and I would advise anyone not to. It's because we're human, because we're people, because we categorize and we have unconscious biases, because that's the way humans operate, not because of our race or our sex. The only way it affects us is in the sense that, as I mentioned in my presentation, our role is to protect and advance the civil rights of Pennsylvanians. So even if I'm not, conducting training that, runs afoul of the executive order, it can be interpreted to reach into really legitimate and important training that protects and advances the rights of Pennsylvanians. And to that extent, its misinterpretation, its misapplication, its heavy-handedness is something that we think is an important concern. And for that reason, I think we would be against continuing to have this executive order if there's a new administration, and we would probably urge for the rescission from this administration.
Thank you very much. I'm going to wrap this up now. And I just want to say, when Ann Van Dyke and I envisioned this and talked to Community Responders Network about this, Robin, Corbett, and Chad, you exceeded my expectations.
Wow.
Incredibly informative, and it's a very appropriate time for this. I want to thank Farzana for co-moderating with me, and Andrea for helping with all the tech matters, and thank all the attendees for sticking with us and learning all of this tonight. As what the panelists said, please be patient, please be safe, and please be healthy also, and have a good night. Bye.
Thank you.
Jennifer.
Everybody.
Ready?